The muddy waters of the Arkansas River churned beneath Jake Thompson's weathered boots as he steadied himself on the creaking dock at Abilene's bustling riverside trading post. The summer of 1875 had brought unprecedented flooding, turning the normally placid waterway into a roiling serpent that threatened to devour everything in its path. As a veteran river trader, Jake had seen his share of nature's fury. But something about this season felt different. An unnatural tension that seemed to hover in the air like gun smoke. The trading post, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings and warehouses, had been Jake's home for the past decade. At 43, his dark hair now streaked with silver, he'd built a reputation as one of the most reliable merchants along the river route. But that reputation came with unexpected burdens, as he was about to discover when Samuel Davis, the local blacksmith, came running toward him with panic etched across his usually stoic face. "Jake, thank God you're here," Samuel wheezed, his broad chest heaving. "William Miller's boy went missing last night. Young Thomas. The Navajo traders who came through yesterday say they saw something strange up near Eagle Bend, but nobody can make sense of their broken English. You're the only one who speaks their language well enough to understand." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He knew Thomas, a bright 12-year-old who often helped sort cargo at the docks. The missing boy wasn't the only trouble brewing. 3 days earlier, a mysterious group of traders had arrived with unusual wares, elaborately carved bone weapons and strange totems that made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. Their leader, a tall man who called himself James Wilson, had paid in gold dust and disappeared upriver before anyone could ask too many questions. Now, with Thomas missing, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that these events were somehow connected. Sarah Johnson, the widow who ran the general store, had been the last to see Thomas. She stood now at the edge of the gathering crowd, her green eyes filled with worry as she clutched a small leather pouch. "He was helping me close up shop," she explained when Jake approached. "Said something about seeing strange lights on the river. I should have stopped him from investigating, Jake. I should have known better." The Navajo traders, led by a young hunter named Key, had made camp just outside town. Their presence was unusual this far east, and their agitation was evident in the way they huddled around their fire, speaking in hushed tones. Jake had learned their language during his years of trading, earning their trust through honest dealings and respect for their ways. As he approached their camp, Key rose to meet him, his dark eyes reflecting the same unease Jake had been feeling. "The river spirits are angry," Key said in his native tongue, gesturing toward the churning waters. "The sacred bow was stolen, and now the waters rise in protest. We followed the thieves this far, but they have powerful medicine, dark magic that leaves no trail." Jake translated for Samuel and Sarah, who had followed him to the camp. The mention of a sacred bow sparked a memory of the strange weapons James Wilson had been carrying. Elizabeth Davis, Samuel's wife, and the town's schoolteacher joined them at the camp, bringing news that further complicated the mystery. "2 more children have disappeared from homesteads upriver," she reported, her voice trembling. "And Mary Wilson, James Wilson's wife, she's been asking strange questions about Navajo burial grounds. Something about a ritual that requires young souls." The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. The stolen sacred bow, the mysterious traders, the missing children, and the angry river spirits. But the picture they formed was darker than anything he'd encountered in his years on the frontier. The sun was setting now, painting the swollen river in shades of blood red, and Jake knew they had precious little time to unravel this mystery before more children vanished into the gathering darkness. Catherine Miller, William's wife and Thomas's mother, had brought Jake a piece of paper she'd found in her son's room. On it was a crude drawing of what looked like a bow made of bone and sinew, surrounded by symbols that matched those on the strange totems Wilson had been trading. Jake showed the drawing to Key, whose face darkened with recognition. "The bow of souls," the young hunter whispered. "It was meant to be destroyed generations ago, if they complete the ritual under the dark moon." The trading post's usual evening bustle had given way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of the angry river and the distant howl of coyotes. Jake studied the worried faces around him. Samuel's determined frown, Sarah's concerned gaze, Elizabeth's trembling hands clutching her shawl. They were all looking to him for answers, but the truth was he was stepping into territory where his years of river trading experience might not be enough to save them. Emma Thompson, Jake's younger sister and the town's healer, arrived with more disturbing news. "The river's higher than it's ever been," she reported. "And I've been treating people for strange symptoms. Fever dreams where they see children walking into the water, following lights that aren't there. Whatever's happening, Jake, it's affecting the whole town." The sun had nearly set now, and somewhere out there, Thomas and the other children were in the hands of those who would use them for unthinkable purposes. Jake pulled his worn leather map from his satchel, spreading it across the trading post's counter as the oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The river's path wound like a serpent between Silver City and Fort Worth, with dozens of hidden inlets and abandoned mining camps where kidnappers could easily hide. His fingers traced the waterways he'd navigated for 20 years, searching for any clue to where Thomas and the others might have been taken. "There's an old Navajo legend," Emma said softly, her medical bag still clutched in her hands, "about spirits that live in the deep pools, beings that lure children away with mysterious lights. I always thought it was just a story to keep little ones from playing near dangerous waters." She paused, meeting Jake's eyes. "But after what I've seen today, I'm not so sure anymore." Samuel, the town's blacksmith, leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the map. "Legend or not, those children are flesh and blood, and someone's taken them. The tracks I found by the river's edge weren't spirit footprints. They were boot marks and wagon wheels." His voice carried the weight of a father's worry. His own daughter Catherine was among the missing. Elizabeth stepped closer, her shawl now wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the growing chill. "The peddler who passed through last week," she said, her voice steadier now. "He spoke of strange lights near Abilene, and children going missing there too. Said the authorities blamed it on mountain lions, but no bodies were ever found." The group fell silent as Sarah burst through the door, her skirts damp from the riverbank. "Jake, you need to see this," she called, holding up a small object that caught the lamplight. It was a silver pendant, one Jake recognized immediately. He'd traded it to Thomas just last month. "I found it upstream, near the old Miller crossing. There's more. Fresh campfire ashes and signs of several horses." Jake rolled up the map with decisive movements. "We'll need supplies," he said, his mind already calculating what they'd require. "Emma, gather whatever medical supplies you can spare. Samuel, we'll need your tracking skills and strength. Elizabeth, see to provisions. Enough for a week's journey." He turned to Sarah, who was already removing her apron. "You know these waters almost as well as I do. We'll take my riverboat as far as we can, then track them on horseback if needed." The trading post erupted into purposeful activity as Jake stepped outside to study the darkening sky. The river's roar seemed to have grown louder, more menacing. A cool wind carried the scent of rain from the distant mountains, and he knew their window of opportunity was closing. If the storms came and the river rose further, tracking would become impossible. William, the elderly storekeeper, appeared at Jake's side, pressing a brass spyglass into his hands. "Found this in my father's things," he said quietly. "The lens is ground crystal, clearer than any I've seen. You'll need it more than I do." His weathered face carried the wisdom of decades spent watching this river and its people. "Whatever's out there, Jake, it's not just taking our children, it's taking our future." Inside, Jake could hear Emma instructing Sarah on the use of various medicines and tinctures, while Samuel's heavy footsteps moved back and forth as he gathered rope and tools. The trading post, usually a place of commerce and casual conversation, had transformed into a command center for their rescue mission. The weight of responsibility settled onto Jake's shoulders like a physical burden, but he welcomed it. He'd spent his life learning every bend and eddy of this river, building relationships with the communities along its banks. Now, those skills would be put to their greatest test. Lightning flickered in the distance as Jake began his final preparations. He knew that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness between Silver City and Fort Worth, Thomas and the other children were waiting to be found. Whether their captors were flesh and blood or something born of ancient legends, Jake had made a silent vow. He would bring them home or die trying. The river had always been his life. Now it had become his battlefield. Jake Thompson wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his horse along the muddy banks of the Arkansas River near Abilene. The sacred Navajo spear he'd been entrusted with was wrapped carefully in oilcloth and strapped across his back. 3 days had passed since young William Davis, the Navajo hunter he'd saved from a rattler's strike, had disappeared from the trading post. The boys' tribe believed dark forces were at work, forces that wanted their ancestral weapon for themselves. Samuel Miller, the trading post operator, had been acting strangely before William vanished. Jake had caught him studying the spear with an unsettling intensity when he thought no one was looking. But Samuel wasn't the type for kidnapping. At least Jake hadn't thought so until now. The whole situation had Jake's instincts screaming that there was more going on than a simple disappearance. The spring floods had transformed the usually placid Arkansas into a churning monster, its muddy waters carrying entire trees downstream like matchsticks. Jake studied the shoreline carefully, looking for any sign of struggle or passage. The Navajo elders had warned him that the spear's power drew both the worthy and the corrupt. Jake wasn't sure he believed in such things, but William's disappearance was too convenient to be coincidence. A flash of color caught Jake's eye. A scrap of red cloth snagged on a branch near the water's edge. He recognized it as matching the shirt William had been wearing. Jake dismounted and examined the area more closely. There were boot prints in the mud, too large to be William's, heading north along the river. At least 3 different sets, he noted grimly. So the boy hadn't simply wandered off. He'd been taken. The trail led to a decrepit riverside cabin Jake had passed many times but never paid much attention to. Now he noticed fresh horse tracks and boot prints around it. Smoke wisped from the chimney despite the warm spring day. Jake tied his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and crept closer. The spear's weight across his back, a constant reminder of what was at stake. William's captors clearly wanted the weapon, but they'd have to go through Jake to get it. Inside the cabin, Jake could hear multiple voices arguing. He recognized Samuel Miller's reedy tone, but the others were unfamiliar. "The boy won't talk," someone growled. "Maybe we should convince him." Jake's blood ran cold at the implied threat. He'd known Samuel was mixed up in this somehow. The trading post operator had always seemed too interested in native artifacts, often offering far more than they were worth. Now, Jake understood why. Through a gap in the wallboards, Jake made out 4 men inside. Samuel Miller stood near a pot-bellied stove while 3 rough-looking strangers loomed over William, who was tied to a chair. Jake recognized one of them as James Wilson, a notorious antiquities thief who'd been operating throughout the territory. So that was Samuel's game. He'd been feeding information to Wilson's gang about valuable native artifacts passing through his trading post. William sat straight-backed despite his bonds, his young face set in fierce defiance. Jake felt a surge of pride. The boy had spirit. But he needed help fast, before Wilson's patience ran out. Jake counted 4 men total inside. Bad odds, but he had surprise on his side. And, he realized with grim amusement, he had exactly what they wanted strapped to his back. Sometimes the best bait was the genuine article. Jake circled to the cabin's rear door, moving silently despite his size. He could use their greed against them. The spear might be sacred to the Navajo, but to Wilson's gang it was just another valuable artifact to sell. They wouldn't be expecting its rightful guardians to come calling. Jake took the weapon from his back and unwrapped it, the ancient wood smooth under his calloused hands. Time to see if the old legends about its power were true. The rear door's hinges protested as Jake eased it open, but the men inside were too focused on William to notice. Jake stepped into the shadowy cabin, spear held ready. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I believe you have something that belongs to my young friend here." The startled outlaws spun toward him, hands dropping to their guns, but they froze at the sight of the spear. Jake smiled grimly. "Now, let's discuss this civilized-like." Wilson's gang were professionals. They didn't waste time with threats or posturing. Guns appeared in their hands with snake-like speed. But Jake was already moving, the spear a blur as he knocked the nearest man's pistol aside. The ancient weapon seemed to come alive in his hands, its movements flowing like water. Later, Jake would wonder if there wasn't something to those old legends after all. But in that moment, he was too busy staying alive to philosophize. Samuel Miller tried to flee but tripped over his own feet, sprawling across the rough floorboards. Wilson and his remaining man split up, trying to flank Jake, but the cabin's cramped interior worked against them. Jake kept moving, using the spear's long reach to disrupt their aim. A shot boomed, deafening in the enclosed space. Jake felt the bullet pass close enough to stir his hair. He responded by sweeping the spear low, taking Wilson's legs out from under him. The fight was brief but brutal. When it ended, Wilson and his men lay groaning on the floor, their guns scattered across the cabin. Samuel Miller huddled in a corner, whimpering. Jake quickly cut William free, checking the boy for injuries. Apart from some bruises and rope burns, he seemed unharmed. "You came," William said simply, his dark eyes shining with trust. Jake squeezed his shoulder. "Course I did, kid. We've got a sacred trust to keep, remember?" They bound the outlaws securely and loaded them onto their own horses for the ride back to Abilene. Samuel Miller would face justice too. His days of betraying his trading partners were over. As they rode, William told Jake how Samuel had lured him away from the trading post with a story about a sick horse needing help. Wilson's gang had been waiting. They'd tried to force William to reveal where the spear was hidden, not realizing Jake had it the whole time. Jake listened grimly to the boy's story, anger building at how these men had used a child's compassion against him. But William hadn't broken under their questioning, protecting the spear's secret with a courage beyond his years. The Navajo elders had chosen their guardian well. Jake glanced at the ancient weapon, now rewrapped and secured across his back. Perhaps there was something to their talk of sacred power after all. The spear had certainly seemed to guide his hands during the fight. The journey back to Abilene proved more treacherous than expected. Storm clouds gathered over the winding river path, turning the afternoon sky an ominous slate gray. Jake kept a watchful eye on their prisoners while William rode close beside him, the boy's shoulders still tense from his ordeal. The sacred spear, though carefully wrapped, seemed to hum with an energy that matched the crackling atmosphere. Thunder rolled across the valley as they approached a narrow section where the trail hugged steep cliffs above the rushing water. Elizabeth, the trading post's resident healer who had often tended to river travelers, had warned Jake about this treacherous stretch. The recent rains had made the path unstable, but it was the only way back without adding 2 days to their journey. A flash of lightning illuminated the shadowy crags above them, and Jake's horse snorted nervously. The lead prisoner, one of Wilson's more vocal gang members, chose that moment to speak up. "You're a fool if you think this ends here," he sneered. "There are others who know about the spear, more powerful people than us. They'll come for it, and neither you nor that Indian boy can stop them." William's face hardened at the man's words, but Jake noticed a flicker of fear in the young hunter's eyes. The boy had already endured more than someone his age should, and Jake silently vowed to ensure no further harm came to his charge. The spear's weight across his back felt heavier with each passing mile, its responsibility growing alongside the gathering storm. They were forced to take shelter in an abandoned riverway station as the storm intensified. Jake secured the prisoners while William tended to the horses in the crude lean-to. The building's weathered walls creaked in the wind, and rain drummed steadily on the tin roof. Through a grimy window, Jake watched the swollen river churn past, its waters dark and threatening. "Thomas warned me this might happen," William said quietly as he returned, water dripping from his poncho. "My uncle saw signs that evil men would come seeking the spear's power. He said the weapon chooses its guardians carefully, testing them before revealing its true strength." The boy's words carried the weight of generations of tribal wisdom, making him sound far older than his years. Jake was about to respond when a sound caught his attention. Horses approaching through the storm. He motioned William to take cover and drew his revolver. Through the rain-streaked glass, he made out several riders emerging from the gloom. Their leader was a familiar figure that made his blood run cold. Catherine Miller, Samuel's sister, and one of the most ruthless traders along the river. Catherine had always resented the Navajo's influence over the regional trade routes, and Jake had heard whispers of her involvement with antiquities thieves who plundered tribal artifacts. Now she sat astride her horse in the downpour, flanked by hard-eyed men who looked more like mercenaries than traders. She must have been the real force behind her brother's betrayal, using him to get close to the spear. "I know you're in there, Jake," Catherine's voice carried over the storm. "Let's discuss this like reasonable people. That artifact is worth more than you can imagine to the right buyers. Name your price." Her words were honeyed, but Jake could hear the steel beneath them. This woman wouldn't leave empty-handed, and she had enough men to make good on any threats. William moved closer to Jake, his young face set with determination. "The spear isn't meant for their kind of people," he whispered. "It carries the spirits of my ancestors. If they try to take it by force..." He left the thought unfinished, but Jake felt the weapon pulse against his back, as if responding to the boy's words. They were trapped between Catherine's gang and the raging river, with 3 prisoners to watch and a sacred trust to protect. Jake checked his ammunition and studied the building's layout, mind racing through options. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and darkness would soon add another challenge to their already desperate situation. Whatever happened next would test not just their survival skills, but the very bonds of trust and duty that had brought them to this moment. The muddy waters of the Missouri River churned violently as Jake Thompson guided his flatboat through the treacherous rapids. His weathered hands gripped the steering oar, muscles straining against the current that threatened to dash them against the rocks. The sacred Navajo spear, its ancient shaft wrapped in leather and adorned with eagle feathers, lay secured beneath an oilcloth tarp. He'd never imagined the weapon would lead him on such a desperate journey upriver from Fort Worth, searching for William Davis's kidnapped daughter Catherine. Thunder rolled across the leaden sky as Samuel Miller, the young Navajo hunter Jake had saved months ago, crouched at the bow scanning the shoreline. The tribal elders had insisted Samuel accompany Jake on this quest, saying the sacred spear's power could only be wielded properly with a Navajo's guidance. Jake still didn't fully understand the weapon's significance, but he'd seen enough strange occurrences lately to keep an open mind. Sarah Wilson huddled beneath a worn blanket amidships, her honey-colored hair whipping in the wind. She'd refused to stay behind in Silver City when news came that her best friend Catherine had been taken by river pirates. The bonds between the 2 women ran deeper than mere friendship. They'd grown up as sisters after Sarah's parents died in a cholera outbreak. Her presence complicated things, but Jake couldn't deny her determination to help. The first signs of trouble came as they rounded a sharp bend. A half-sunken keelboat blocked most of the channel, its splintered hull barely visible above the muddy water. Samuel's sharp eyes caught movement on the forested bank, a flash of red cloth quickly hidden behind a massive cottonwood. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the sacred spear as he guided their craft closer to shore. Something about this felt wrong. 3 men hiding in the trees, Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the river's rush. 2 more in that collapsed fishing shack upstream. They're waiting to ambush any boats that try to pass. Jake nodded grimly. These weren't ordinary river pirates. Their trap was too well planned. Someone had tipped them off that Jake was coming. Someone who knew about the sacred spear's power. Sarah suddenly gasped and pointed to a scrap of blue fabric caught on a low-hanging branch, the same distinctive color as the dress Catherine had been wearing when she disappeared. Jake's jaw clenched as he noted fresh boot prints in the mud below. They were close, perhaps only hours behind their quarry. But first, they'd have to get past this ambush without losing everything. The sacred spear seemed to pulse with energy as Jake carefully unwrapped it, the ancient symbols carved into its shaft glowing with a faint blue light. Samuel began chanting softly in Navajo, his words carrying on the wind. The sky darkened further as storm clouds gathered overhead, responding to forces Jake couldn't comprehend. He'd seen the spear's power before, but never like this. "Get ready," Jake murmured to Sarah as he positioned himself by the steering oar. "When I give the word, drop flat." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Samuel continued his chant, the strange syllables seeming to echo across the water. The hidden watchers in the trees shifted uneasily, sensing something wasn't right. Jake allowed himself a grim smile as he felt the spear's energy building like electricity before a lightning strike. The attack came suddenly, 5 men bursting from cover with rifles raised. But Jake was ready. As Samuel's chant reached a crescendo, he thrust the sacred spear skyward. Blue-white lightning exploded from its tip, striking the massive cottonwood and sending it crashing down between them and their attackers. The boom of thunder drowned out their startled cries as Jake quickly pulled the flatboat past the barrier. They worked their way upstream through the growing storm, following the trail of clues Catherine had cleverly left behind. A hair ribbon here, a button there. The sacred spear's power had saved them once, but Jake knew their real test still lay ahead. According to Samuel, the weapon's greatest power could only be unleashed at a terrible price. As thunder rolled overhead, Jake prayed they wouldn't need to discover what that price might be. Evening found them moored in a hidden cove, discussing their next move. Samuel's tribal knowledge suggested their quarry was heading for an abandoned trading post 3 bends upstream. A perfect hideout for river pirates. Sarah huddled close to the small fire, worry etching lines in her young face as she stared into the flames. "We'll find her," Jake promised softly. Whatever it takes. The sacred spear lay across Jake's knees as he kept watch, its surface catching the firelight like drops of blood. Samuel had explained that the weapon chose its wielders carefully. If someone unworthy tried to use its power, the consequences could be devastating. Jake wondered what the spear had seen in him that made him worthy. Perhaps they'd all find out soon enough. As dawn approached, Jake found himself thinking of Thomas Johnson, the traitor who'd first told him about Catherine's kidnapping. Something about the man's manner had seemed off. He'd known details that hadn't been made public. Could he be working with the river pirates? The pieces were starting to fit together in a disturbing pattern. Their rescue mission was about to become far more complicated. The first rays of morning light had barely touched the canyon walls when Jake heard the distinctive sound of horses approaching. He quickly doused the fire and motioned for Sarah to take cover behind the rocks. The sacred spear hummed, with an almost imperceptible vibration in his hands as he crouched low, watching the trail above through narrowed eyes. His instincts about Thomas Johnson had been right. The traitor himself appeared on horseback, leading a group of rough-looking men toward the riverbend. Jake's heart pounded as he recognized Catherine among the prisoners. She was bound but appeared unharmed, sitting astride a horse led by one of Thomas's men. The river pirates had established their hideout just as he'd suspected, using the natural caves along the waterway to store their stolen goods. Thomas had been their inside man all along, using his position as a respected trader to gather intelligence and identify valuable targets. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as she whispered urgently, "There's James too. They must have caught him when he tried to warn us." Indeed, Jake could now see his old friend bound alongside Catherine, his face bruised but his eyes alert and searching the surroundings. The situation had become even more precarious, with two lives now hanging in the balance. The sacred spear grew warmer in Jake's grip as he formulated a plan. Samuel had warned him that the weapon's power was tied to justice and protection. It would respond most strongly when used to defend the innocent. Jake could feel that power now, thrumming through the ancient wood like distant thunder. He thought of the young Navajo hunter he'd saved, of the trust the tribe had placed in him by sharing their sacred weapon. Moving with deliberate stealth, Jake positioned himself on a rocky outcrop above the pirates' camp, while Sarah circled around to create a diversion downstream. The morning mist still clung to the river, providing additional cover as Jake observed the camp's layout. Thomas was clearly nervous, constantly checking the surrounding cliffs as if expecting trouble. The other men seemed more concerned with dividing up their stolen goods than watching their prisoners. When Sarah's signal came, a perfectly mimicked owl call that echoed off the canyon walls, Jake channeled every ounce of focus into the spear. The weapon suddenly felt as light as a feather in his hands, and time seemed to slow as he took aim at the rope securing the prisoners' horses. The spear flew true, slicing through the bonds and startling the horses into motion just as Sarah's diversionary fire erupted near the stored gunpowder. Chaos erupted in the camp as horses bolted and men scrambled for cover from the explosions. Jake had already moved to a new position, the spear somehow having returned to his grip without him consciously retrieving it. He could see the confusion and fear on Thomas's face as the traitor realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Catherine and James had managed to stay mounted during the commotion and were now galloping toward the prearranged meeting point downstream. Thomas raised his rifle, taking aim at the escaping prisoners, but Jake felt the spear's power surge through him once more. This time, when he threw it, the weapon seemed to leave a trail of silver light in its wake. The rifle exploded in Thomas's hands, sending him sprawling backward as his remaining men fled into the morning mist, their nerve completely broken by the display of supernatural power. Jake found himself standing over the fallen traitor, the spear once again in his hands, though he couldn't remember catching it. Thomas stared up at him with a mixture of terror and awe, all pretense of being a respectable businessman stripped away. "The spirits of this land don't look kindly on those who abuse its people's trust," Jake said quietly, understanding now why the weapon had chosen him as its temporary guardian. Sarah appeared with the local lawman she'd stationed nearby, and they quickly took Thomas and his surviving men into custody. As Jake watched them being led away, he felt the spear's power settling back into dormancy. Catherine and James were safe, justice had been served, and the river trading routes would be secure again. Yet Jake knew this experience had changed him forever. He had glimpsed a deeper truth about the land and its ancient powers, one that would stay with him long after he returned the sacred weapon to its rightful guardians. The sun hung low over the muddy waters of the Arkansas River, as Jake Thompson watched the Navajo scouts fan out along the shoreline near Abilene. 2 weeks had passed since Mary Wilson's disappearance from the trading post, and the sacred bow he'd been gifted now felt heavy across his back. The young medicine man he'd saved, Samuel, insisted the weapon's ancient magic would guide them to her. But Jake's faith was wearing thin as autumn's chill crept into the wind. Elizabeth Davis, the trading post owner's wife, stood beside him wringing her hands as she scanned the riverbank. "The Navajo say she was taken by river pirates, Jake. They've seen their boats skulking around after dark." Her voice trembled with the weight of unspoken fears. Mary had been like a daughter to her since coming west as a teacher last spring. Sarah Miller, their best tracker, approached with purpose in her stride. "Found fresh marks on the landing, maybe 3 days old. Multiple boats pulled in here." She pointed to deep grooves in the mud where heavy vessels had been dragged ashore. "They're moving captives upriver toward Silver City, trading them to the mining camps." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of such operations, but hadn't wanted to believe they reached this far into settled territory. Samuel appeared at his side, dark eyes intense. "The bow speaks of water spirits disturbed upstream. Many souls in pain cry out from the river's embrace." The young hunter traced symbols in the air, murmuring ancient prayers. James Miller, Sarah's husband and the local blacksmith, joined their group with his Winchester clutched tight. "Got word from a steamboat captain this morning. Says he spotted a suspicious camp about 40 miles north, hidden in a willow grove. Could be their staging ground before moving the captives inland." His weathered face was grim with determination. Catherine Thompson, Jake's sister who served as the settlement's doctor, arrived with saddlebags full of medical supplies. "If Mary's been held all this time, she'll need care when we find her." She shared a meaningful look with Jake, both knowing the horrors such captives often endured. The sacred bow seemed to pulse against his spine, resonating with their shared purpose. Thomas Wilson, Mary's father, had been inconsolable these past weeks, but now he stood straight-backed and ready. "The Navajo say that bow chose you for a reason, Jake. If it can lead us to my girl, I'll believe in any magic it possesses." His faith moved Jake deeply, knowing how the proud rancher typically dismissed native beliefs. They set out at first light, 4 boats gliding silently through the morning mist. Samuel's people flanked them on both shores, moving like shadows through the riverside brush. The sacred bow grew warmer against Jake's back with each mile they covered, its ancient power awakening as they drew closer to their quarry. Near midday, they found the first real sign: scraps of Mary's blue calico dress caught in riverside brambles. William Davis, Elizabeth's husband, retrieved the fabric with trembling hands. "She's marking her trail for us," he whispered hoarsely. "My God, she's alive and fighting!" The discovery energized their whole party. The willow grove appeared as the sun began its westward slide, a dense tangle of branches screening the riverbank from view. Samuel raised his hand for silence as Jake felt the bow practically burning through his shirt. The young medicine man's eyes were distant, communing with forces Jake could only imagine. "They are here, 23 captive souls, and 12 dark hearts keeping them." Jake gathered their rescue party close, laying out the plan in hushed tones. Sarah and 3 Navajo scouts would circle behind through the willows, while James led a diversionary approach from downstream. Jake, Samuel, and Thomas would drive straight in once the shooting started, trusting in the bow's protection. The attack came together like a dance, each group moving in perfect coordination. The river pirates were caught completely off guard, their attention divided between multiple threats. Jake felt the bow's power surge through him as he drew and fired, his arrows finding marks that should have been impossible through the tangled brush. They found Mary among the captives, thin and battered but unbroken. She fell into her father's arms with a sob, while Catherine rushed to check her injuries. The other prisoners emerged from crude holding pens, women and children from settlements all along the river, some taken months ago. Samuel blessed each one as they were freed. That evening, as the rescued captives reunited with families who had been summoned from nearby settlements, Jake stood alone by the river. Samuel joined him, bearing 2 cups of ceremonial tea. "The bow chose well," the young hunter said simply. "It saw in you a warrior's heart guided by compassion. Our people's paths are now bound together by more than trade. Jake sipped the bitter tea, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The sacred bow hummed contentedly against his back, its power settling into a quiet vigilance. He knew his life had changed forever the day he'd saved Samuel from that snake, but only now did he truly understand the magnitude of that change. The river would need guardians in the years ahead, and he had been chosen to stand watch. Mary found him later, wrapped in a borrowed blanket but standing tall. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Father told me about the bow's magic, how it led you to us. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for all the old powers that still live in this land." Jake simply nodded, knowing some experiences defied ordinary words. As stars began to pepper the darkening sky, the gathered families shared a meal of Thanksgiving. Navajo and settler alike broke bread together, united by the day's events. Jake caught Samuel's eye across the fire and raised his cup in silent tribute. The young medicine man smiled, both of them knowing this was just the beginning of a new chapter in the river's long story. The sacred bow would be needed again, its ancient magic helping to forge understanding between two peoples who shared the same land. Jake Thompson, once a simple trader, had found his true calling as a bridge between worlds. The river flowing past their fire would carry word of this day to all the settlements along its course, a reminder that the frontier's greatest strength lay in unity, not division. As autumn painted the riverbanks in amber and gold, Jake found himself increasingly called upon to mediate between settlers and the Navajo. The sacred bow, now openly displayed in his trading post, drew curious visitors from both communities. He'd learned to recognize the subtle way it hummed when important decisions loomed, its ancient magic a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. One crisp morning, Samuel arrived with troubling news. A group of settlers from Silver City had begun diverting the river upstream, threatening both the Navajo farming lands and the delicate peace. The young medicine man's face was drawn with concern as he explained how the water levels had dropped dangerously low. "The spirits are restless, Jake. The bow showed me visions of dry fields and suffering on both sides." Jake knew the settlers involved, Thomas and James Mackenzie, brothers who'd recently acquired land near the river's bend. They were good men at heart but short-sighted in their ambitions. Loading the sacred bow onto his horse, Jake rode out with Samuel to assess the situation. The river's usual robust flow had indeed dwindled to a concerning trickle where the Mackenzies had built their irrigation channels. At the construction site, they found William, the older Mackenzie brother's son, supervising the work. The young man's initial defensiveness softened when he recognized Jake from previous trading. "We're within our rights," William insisted, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "The deed says the water access is ours." Jake noticed how the bow trembled slightly in its wrapping, responding to the tension in the air. That evening, Jake called a meeting at his trading post. The Mackenzie brothers sat across from Samuel and 3 Navajo elders, the sacred bow displayed prominently between them. As Jake translated, he felt its ancient power filling the room, somehow making his words carry more weight. He spoke of shared resources, of the river's significance to both peoples, and of the prosperity that could come from cooperation rather than conflict. The breakthrough came when Samuel shared his tribe's generations of knowledge about the river's patterns and seasonal flows. The Navajo had developed sophisticated irrigation techniques that could benefit everyone while preserving the water's natural course. To everyone's surprise, it was Catherine, Thomas Mackenzie's wife, who first grasped the potential. "We could learn from each other," she said, her practical wisdom cutting through the tension. "Our children will inherit this land together." Over the following weeks, the two communities worked side by side to modify the irrigation system. Jake watched with quiet satisfaction as William and young Navajo warriors exchanged techniques and stories, their initial wariness transforming into genuine camaraderie. The sacred bow seemed to pulse with approval as the river's flow strengthened, nourishing both people's lands equally. Word of the successful collaboration spread along the river trading routes. Traders arriving from Abilene and Fort Worth brought news of other communities seeking similar solutions to shared challenges. The bow's influence extended far beyond its physical presence, becoming a symbol of the possibility of harmony between different ways of life. As winter approached, Jake stood with Samuel on the riverbank where they'd first met months ago. The young medicine man had grown into his role, now respected by both communities for his wisdom. "The bow chose well," Samuel said, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of fire. "It knew you would understand its purpose, not as a weapon, but as a tool for peace." Jake reflected on how his life had changed since that fateful day of the snakebite. The trading post had become more than a place of commerce. It was a gathering point where two worlds met and learned from each other. The sacred bow had transformed him from a simple trader into something more, a keeper of balance, a bridge between traditions. That night, as families from both communities gathered for the harvest celebration, Jake noticed how naturally they mingled, sharing food and stories. Emma, his young niece who helped at the trading post, sat fascinated as an elderly Navajo woman taught her to weave. The sacred bow hung above them, its presence a reminder that the greatest magic lay not in ancient powers, but in the simple act of people choosing to understand each other. The river flowed on, its waters carrying the promise of a different kind of frontier, one where diversity brought strength, and ancient wisdom guided the path to the future. Jake Thompson had found his true legacy, not in the goods he traded, but in the bridges he helped build between peoples. The sacred bow had shown him that some treasures were meant not to be possessed, but to be shared for the benefit of all.